Welcome back, sports fans. I was reading an article earlier today about Jim Harbaugh wanting to change the rules for college eligibility as it pertains to the NFL draft. What he would like to see are essentially three different things. One is that there's not a 3-year eligibility requirement, but rather no eligibility requirement, and that college players can enter the draft at any time. Second thing that he'd like to see is he'd like to see the number of scholarships increase by more than 25 per team. And then thirdly, he would like to see it that if a player leaves early, that they get 1 year of education paid for by the university after they turn pro. Or I believe, if I've read it correctly, 1 year for every year they attend in order to finish their education after they turn pro. The first thing I will address to this is the eligibility requirements. I agree that 3 years is a long time to wait, and certainly Maurice Clarett many years ago challenged this in court and lost. And he and Mike Williams turned out to be busts, so it didn't really help him too much. But it's interesting that it was challenged, and not surprisingly so. With that having been said, I think we have to be careful about the slippery slope, because this did happen in the NBA, and we started having freshmen coming out, and while some of them, like Stephon Marbury, panned out, I'm sure there were plenty of them who did not. And certainly high schoolers, and especially those who remember the Pistons drafting one Corleone Young, that didn't turn out so well. Now, Jim Harbaugh is not saying that we ought to have high school football players be able to enter the NFL draft, but he is saying he'd like to see it where they can enter at any time. And also, if they don't hire an agent, and they're not drafted, that they're allowed to be reinstated. What my plan is for this, and what I would like to see, is while I agree with Jim Harbaugh that I would like to see the 3-year eligibility requirement from high school dropped, it would be hard to imagine allowing freshmen to enter the draft. I mean, if you allow them to enter as sophomores, okay, but let's say you do allow freshmen to enter. Okay, I'd be okay with that as opposed to the 3-year rule. That's not a problem. I also agree that if they don't hire an agent, that they ought to be allowed to go back to school. But why, instead of them not being drafted, allowing them back in, how about we allow them to talk to the NFL and talk to somebody like Mel Kiper Jr. or Todd McShay, find out where their draft status would be if they did leave, use that to assess where they would be drafted, and then they can make a better and more informed decision. As long as they don't hire an agent, their college eligibility ought to be intact. But I definitely would not I definitely would not want high school players trying to go directly to the NFL. It's a lot different for basketball players because you have to have a more developed body, I would say, primarily, and especially if you're an offensive or defensive lineman in the NFL, than you would be just going to the NBA, where you can go on talent alone and then work on your body as you go along. Anthony Davis would be a great example of that, as would Michael Jordan, and I'm sure there are plenty of other players I'm not thinking of offhand that would fit that mode. So with that having been said, like I said, I would like to see the adjustment, but I would like to see it to where even if you're drafted, as long as you don't hire an agent, you can go back. And the one player I'm thinking of as it applies to the NBA that really benefited from this would be Vashawn Leonard years ago. I believe that was 1993, where he was a second-round selection by the Bucks, went back to school, still was a second-round selection, but improved his draft status by about 20 spots. So that's why let's see. I mean, teams are not going to be happy about this because they'll lose a draft selection if they're not able to sign the player, or they elect to go back to school, obviously. I get that. But if you do that, I think that'd be good. In terms of increasing the number of scholarships from 25, I think if you do that, it's just going to make the rich schools richer. I mean, it certainly would help the SEC. There's no question about that. Question in my mind is, does the SEC need to become any more powerful or need to get any more talent, especially after what we saw in the NFL draft, where a record number of players from the conference were drafted? I mean, I understand how it would help the Big Ten, but I believe it would help the SEC even more. And it would just cause more of a separation between the Power 5 schools and the rest of the universities. And I don't think that's a direction that I would want to see college football head in. If anything, I think strides need to be taken a little bit to close the gap, although be it it's not the SEC's fault for being better than everybody else. That's a real credit to the SEC. It's a real credit to Nick Saban, but also collectively, it's a credit to every school in the conference. In terms of the third point, I don't know what to think about that one. I mean, it's kind of tough with players doing what they do, for sure. In terms of going pro, if they make enough money from turning pro, doesn't that defeat the purpose of a university having to then pay for their education when they'll have enough money from their pro careers to pay for it themselves? That's where I stand on that one. So I don't know where Jim Harbaugh is coming from there exactly, but I sort of get it because a lot of players don't go back and they don't finish their degrees, and it would be good if they did so. So that one I'm a little more skeptical on, but certainly, I mean, Jim Harbaugh raising issues about the draft. I don't think it's going to happen based on what I read that there are going to be any changes anytime soon. But I would like to see eligibility increased to where you don't have to wait the 3 years from high school to be sure. In the final segment, I'm going to be discussing my thoughts for the resumption of the NBA season and catch all of you up to speed from what I know. Stay tuned on Sports with Ed on Ed's Sports Channel.